Well, welcome to all of you. It is a great honor to be here. I want to extend my thanks to Pam Yanko, without whom this would have never happened. And we're overwhelmed by the response and by the size of the audience. I want to welcome, of course, my friends, the SS St. Louis passengers, and I want to hasten to add of their enormous contribution to American society. Turned away by the country they love so much, they return here and have made contributions that would have made us all very proud. Let me take you back for a moment to June 6, 1939. A refugee ship carrying 900 Jews is anchored off the coast of Miami Beach, within sight of the beautiful beaches and the palm trees. The men, women, and children of the SS St. Louis are fleeing the hellfire of Nazi Germany. They plead with the American government to grant them safe haven in the United States. President Franklin Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull deny them safety within the borders of America. They are forced to return to Europe, where many perish. Hitler would now say that no country wanted the Jews, even the United States. The rejection of this refugee ship would become the symbol of the world indifference to the plight of the European Jews, thereby giving Adolf Hitler his justification for pursuing the final solution. Tonight you will see the trial of Franklin Roosevelt. You will be called upon as jurors to deliberate whether the Roosevelt administration was complicit in crimes against humanity. The saga of the SS St. Louis is an immigration story, a human rights story, and a lesson that teaches us that when political ambition is chosen over humanitarian need, the consequences can be catastrophic. Perhaps among you is a future leader. I don't know if there's ever been a president from Nebraska, but if there hasn't, perhaps he or she is sitting here. And to remind you that at some point, people of influence are called upon to make a decision which may be unpopular for their constituency, but when they know it's the right thing to do, they must do it. And that's what tonight will teach us. Thank you very much.
I feel wicked, sleeping in a warm bed while my dearest friends have been knocked down or have fallen into a gutter somewhere out in the cold night. I get frightened when I think of close friends who have now been delivered into the hands of the cruelest brutes that walk the earth. And all because they are Jews. It's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals, because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them, because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder, which will destroy us too. I can feel the sufferings of millions.
To hear the case of Higher Humanity versus Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The charges are set forth in the Bill of Indictment. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, late of Warm Springs, Georgia, is charged with complicity by acts of omission, which furthered the Third Reich's plans for the final solution. At the conclusion of this trial, you, the jury, will be asked to deliberate upon the evidence and come to a proper verdict. Justice Holmes, you may proceed.
Members of the jury, acts of omission have grave consequences. When confronted with the horrors of religious and racial persecution, the defendant failed to act. When confronted with the horrors of genocide, the defendant failed to act. When presented with the chance to grant safe haven to refugees fleeing Nazi persecution, who were within sight of America's shores. The defendant failed to act. The prosecution will demonstrate that his failure to act was motivated out of his lust for power and his single-minded determination to win the 1940 and 1944 presidential elections. Furthermore, the political decisions he made to further his presidential ambitions sent a message to the Third Reich that the European Jewish community was expendable.
Mr. Kennedy.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So reads the oath of office that the President takes upon assuming the position of the highest office in the land. In taking that oath, he is charged with protecting the interests of the United States, and when necessary, invoking his powers as Commander-in-Chief. It was this president who persuaded an isolationist Congress that the Nazi aggression was an imminent threat to world peace. And it was this president who, with courage and foresight, guided the Allies to a historic victory in World War II, and in doing so saved millions of innocent lives.
Prosecution may call his first witness.
Your Honor, the prosecution calls Joseph Kennedy to the stand. Let the record show that Joseph Kennedy first served in the Roosevelt administration in 1934 when he was appointed chairman of the newly created Securities and Exchange Commission. In March of 1938, Mr. Kennedy was appointed ambassador to the United Kingdom and served in that capacity until November 1940. Mr. Kennedy, can you tell the court your personal sentiments toward the Jewish people?
Objection! What is the relevancy of this?
Mr. Holmes.
Your Honor, the question of Joseph Kennedy's appointment as ambassador to the Court of St. James hovers over the Roosevelt administration like a dark cloud. A member of the British Parliament, Baron Wedgwood, said of Kennedy, "We have a rich man here, untrained in diplomacy, unlearned in history and politics, who is a great publicity seeker." Your Honor, the appointment of Joseph Kennedy, whose anti-Jewish attitudes were common knowledge, suggests Franklin Roosevelt's strategy to run for a third term. In choosing Kennedy, Roosevelt could appeal to both his anti-Semitic and isolationist constituencies, and in doing so, he sent a signal to Hitler that America tacitly endorsed the Reich's anti-Jewish persecution.
Proceed.
Mr. Kennedy, during your stay in London as ambassador, did you have the occasion to meet Herbert von Dirksen?
Yes.
Can you tell the court who he was?
He was the German ambassador to Great Britain.
Did you discuss with him matters related to the Nazi persecution of the Jews? Mr. Kennedy, did you discuss matters related to the Nazi persecution of the Jews?
We discussed many things.
Your Honor, I now wish to mark and admit into evidence Prosecutions Exhibit 1, documents from the German Foreign Ministry of 1938-39 describing meetings with Joseph Kennedy and von Dirksen. They read as follows. Ambassador Joe Kennedy understood Hitler's Jewish policy completely. That Kennedy himself mentioned that very strong anti-Semitic feelings existed in the U.S., and that a large portion of the population had an understanding of the German attitude toward the Jews. That Kennedy was Germany's best friend in London. Is that true? Were you Adolf Hitler's best friend in London?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Mr. Kennedy, did you know a person by the name of Harvey Klemmer?
Yes.
Can you tell the court your relationship with Mr. Klemmer?
Mr. Clemmer worked under me at the Maritime Commission, and then as my aide in London when I served as ambassador.
Did you confide to your aide, Harvey Klemmer, that individual Jews are all right, but as a race they stink? They spoil everything they touch. Look what they did to the movies.
I do not recall.
That you often referred to the Jews as kites and sheenies.
I had many Jewish friends.
Did you employ Clemmer as a pimp to procure women for you?
Objection!
Sustained.
Mr. Kennedy, during your service as ambassador, did you confer directly with President Roosevelt on matters related to war, diplomacy, and refugee policy?
Yes.
Were you required to brief Secretary of State Hull prior to conferring with the President?
No. I had direct access.
Then the President was aware of your activities as ambassador to Great Britain.
I believe so.
Your Honor, I wish to mark and admit into evidence Prosecutions Exhibit 2, the statement on Joseph Kennedy from British Senior Foreign Secretary Lord Robert Van Sident. Kennedy is a foul specimen of a double-crosser and defeatist who thinks only of lining his own pockets. Exhibit 3, the diary of Kennedy's aide and confidant, Harvey Clemmer, who reveals that Kennedy, while using the prestige of the embassy to advance his liquor franchise, obtained space for 200,000 cases, thus commandeering precious cargo space on the merchant marine ships. And Exhibit 4, top secret files of MI5 on the treason perpetrated by Tyler Kent, Ambassador Kennedy's cipher expert, a known Jew hater, who forwarded confidential embassy communications to the Germans. Your Honor, and members of the jury, in March 1938, the war clouds had begun to gather over Europe. During Ambassador Kennedy's tenure, the Germans would annex Austria and the Sudetenland. They would overrun Holland, Belgium, France. They would terror bomb London. The German Jews were desperate to seek safe haven. The position of ambassador to Great Britain was the most important post in the entire foreign service. Why would Franklin D. Roosevelt appoint this man to this post at this critical moment in history? Perhaps we shall find an answer when Franklin Roosevelt takes the stand. No further questions?
Prosecution may call his next witness.
Your Honor, I call Cordell Hull. That the court take judicial notice of Mr. Hull's extraordinary career as the longest-serving Secretary of State in American history. He served President Franklin Roosevelt from 1933 through 1944 and advised the President on the most critical foreign policy issues facing the country. Mr. Secretary, how would you characterize the Roosevelt administration's policy on the Jewish refugee question during the years 1938 through 1944?
Within the limits of the Immigration Act of 1924, we were highly active in our efforts to assist refugees suffering under the Third Reich.
Is that so? In June of 1939, do you recall an urgent request from a refugee ship carrying 909 Jewish refugees after its passengers had been denied entry into Havana, Cuba?
Yes.
Do you recall the name of that ship?
It was called the SS St. Louis. It departed from Hamburg, Germany on May 13, 1939, and arrived in a port in Havana in late May. We assisted the American Joint Distribution Committee in their efforts to negotiate with the Cuban authorities, but to no avail.
What happened after the ship was ordered to leave Cuban waters?
It arrived in U.S. waters on June 5th. We received a message from the captain requesting safe harbor for the passengers from a U.S. port in southern Florida.
What was the disposition of this request?
Based upon the Immigration Act of 1924, the U.S. government had no choice but to deny the request.
Did the passengers have quota numbers to enter the U.S.?
Yes, but the numbers had not come up. It would have been unfair to place them ahead of others.
Was there no way to help these refugees?
Not under existing law.
Secretary of Interior Ickes said that Alaska might be available for the refugees.
Not under existing law.
The governor of the Virgin Islands said he would accept the refugees.
Not feasible under
Could
existing
they
law.
have been declared temporary workers until the quota numbers came up?
Not possible.
Emergency executive order on humanitarian grounds?
No.
Mr. Secretary, do you recall the events in Germany on November 9th and 10th, 1938?
Yes.
It was a widespread wave of persecution against the Jews living under the Third Reich.
I am aware of that.
Many of the male passengers on the St. Louis had to go through great hardship to even reach our shores. Are you aware that some had already been interned for a time at Buchenwald and Dachau after being arrested during that pogrom?
Yes.
When the Roosevelt administration refused safe haven to the refugees, what did you think their fate would be?
Objection.
Sustained.
Mr. Secretary, did you seek the Democratic nomination for president in the election of 1940?
Objection, Your Honor. What is the relevance of Cordell Hull's political ambitions as it relates to the alleged complicity of Franklin Roosevelt in crimes against humanity?
Mr. Prosecutor, I'm going to give you some latitude here. We'll move quickly.
Yes. What is the connection between Cordell Hull's political ambitions and President Roosevelt's complicity? Mr. Hull, did you seek the Democratic nomination for president in 1940?
Yes.
Did the president endorse your candidacy?
I had thought so.
Can you think of any reason why he wouldn't have? Mr. Secretary, what is your wife's maiden name? Her maiden name was Witz, wasn't it? Frances Witz. What kind of a name is that?
It was a European name.
In fact, it was an Austrian name. Was there any reason you wanted to hide your wife's family name?
Objection! This is nothing but a fishing expedition.
Overruled. I want to hear this.
Your Honor, I wish to mark and admit into evidence Prosecutions Exhibit 5. Cordell Hull's submission of his wife's family name into the register of Who's Who. The name listed is Whitney, which was not Mrs. Hull's family name, but her name from her first marriage. Mr. Secretary, why did you deliberately misrepresent your wife's family name in such an important social register? I will tell you why. Witz was a Jewish name, wasn't it? Your wife, Frances Witz, was born into an Austrian Jewish family. You believe that her Jewish heritage would cost you the presidential nomination.
No.
When the SS St. Louis entered U.S. waters on that fateful day in June, the only thing that concerned you was your political ambition. If you had saved these passengers from possible torture and death, you would have called attention to your wife's Jewishness.
It wasn't like that.
You recommended to the president that America deny safe haven, and he was happy to have you do his dirty work because he himself did not want the political liability of helping these Jewish refugees.
It was the existing law at the time.
The president believed that your wife's Jewish ancestry would damage your chances of getting the nomination.
He did not.
He used that fact to undermine your chances for presidency, which, while he secretly planned to run for a third term.
That's not the way it was.
Your Honor, I wish to mark and admit into evidence Prosecutions Exhibit 6, the text of a conversation between President Franklin Roosevelt and the senator from Montana, Burton Wheeler. The president told Wheeler in August 1939 that a Hull candidacy would be problematic because Mrs. Hull's Jewishness would be raised by his opponents. Roosevelt added, "Mrs. Hull is about one-half Jewish. You and I, Bert, are Old English and Dutch stock. We know who our ancestors are. We know there's no Jewish blood in our veins, but a lot of these people do not know whether there's Jewish blood in their veins or not." It is a terrible thing to be Jewish, isn't it, Mr. Hull? To have Jewish blood in our veins. One wonders how your wife and her family would have fared under Hitler. Your Honor, and members of the jury, the Roosevelt administration's refusal to grant safe haven to the passengers of the SS St. Louis set the tone for the American government's response to the entire refugee crisis during World War II. It was a case of political ambition over humanitarian need, and sent a clear message to Adolf Hitler that the Jewish people were expendable. No further questions.
The witness is excused. Does the prosecution wish to call any other witnesses?
Your Honor, we reserve the right to call Franklin D. Roosevelt, pending defense decision to call him as witness.
Your Honor, defense wishes to call Eleanor Roosevelt to the stand. court take judicial notice of the fact that the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, was at her husband's side for his entire presidency. She was privy to his most intimate thoughts and was aware of his deepest feelings. Mrs. Roosevelt, can you classify the president's attitudes towards the American Jewish community?
He deeply cared about the welfare of the American Jews, and they in turn were devoted to him.
And did they support him in the 4 elections in which he sought the presidency?
The Jews gave him overwhelming support.
Your Honor, and the jury, I wish to mark and admit into evidence Defense Exhibit A, a summary of the Jewish electoral support for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In the election of 1932, the Jews voted 82% in favor of the president. In 1936, 85%. In 1940 and 44, 90%. The Jews of America recognized the president's love and devotion to them. He fought for the rights of hardworking men and women. He was a powerful voice that stood up against prejudice. Mrs. Roosevelt, did the president appoint men of the Jewish faith to important government posts?
My husband appointed Jews to the highest positions in his administration.
And did you and your husband avail yourselves of Jewish friendships?
Bernard Baruch was our dearest friend and companion.
And did he support the establishment of a Jewish homeland?
President Roosevelt was a committed pro-Zionist and lobbied vigorously for the establishment of the ancestral home of the Jews in Palestine.
Lastly, why didn't the president allow more Jewish immigrants to enter the country during this terrible period?
The president wanted to assist the refugees suffering under the Nazis, but a hostile Congress made it impossible to increase immigration quotas.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Holmes.
Mrs. Roosevelt, were you contacted in September 1940 by one Jacob Morowitz, an attorney in Newport News, Virginia?
Yes.
Why did Mr. Morowitz contact you?
He sought my assistance on a matter regarding Jewish refugees.
Are you referring to the Jewish refugees aboard the Portuguese ship SS Kwanzaa docked in the port of Norfolk?
Yes.
What did Mr. Morowitz want you to do?
He wanted me to intervene on behalf of the refugees, so they would not have to return to the dangerous situation in Europe.
Did you intervene?
I prevailed upon my husband to act on behalf of these Jews.
And act he did. Your Honor, I now wish to mark and admit into evidence Prosecutions Exhibit 7, the emergency executive order signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt that ordered his Assistant Secretary of State Long to grant safe haven to aliens aboard the SS Kwanzaa in the following cases. Bona fide political refugees whom the President's Advisory Committee on Political Refugees will certify for admission. Mrs. Roosevelt, did the committee certify these refugees for admission into the U.S.?
Yes.
Can you tell this court why the President acted on behalf of the 81 Jewish refugees from the SS Kwanzaa on September 14, 1940, and not the 909 Jewish refugees on the SS St. Louis on June 6, 1939? Your silence is deafening, Mrs. Roosevelt. It was the same chilling silence that the passengers on the SS St. Louis felt when they sent telegrams to you and the President begging to be saved. But there was a difference. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in mid-September 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt had secured the Democratic nomination for a third term. The presidential election was but weeks away. There was no political liability in allowing a few suffering Jews into the United States.
Objection. Prosecution is merely speculating.
Sustained.
Members of the jury, this president sought to maintain political power at the expense of men, women, and children at risk. The story of the SS Kwanzaa demonstrates unequivocally that the diplomatic machinery was in place to help the Jewish refugees if the political will was there. Unfortunately, under this president, it wasn't always. No further questions.
Dear Diary, the Jews have suffered in Europe as has no other group. The percentage killed among them in the past few years far exceeds the losses among any of the nations in battles which have been fought throughout the war. Many of them, for generations, considered Germany, Poland, Romania, and France their country and permanent home. I do not know what we can do to save the Jews in Europe and to find them homes, but I know that we will be the sufferers if we let great wrongs occur without exerting ourselves to correct them.
Your Honor, I call the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Mr. President, why did you decide to violate tradition and seek a third term of office?
The Nazis were threatening all of Europe. Our peace mission in early 1940 failed, and by the summer, the Germans occupied Paris. I felt that I was the only one with the necessary experience to guide the nation through this troubled time.
What about the other possible candidates?
The party felt that I had the best chance to defeat Wendell Willkie.
James Foley?
Couldn't win.
James Nance Garner?
A drunk cannot lead.
Cordell Hull?
Health problems.
Mr. President, once being made fully aware of the fate of the Jews, did you make any direct efforts to try and save them?
When our intelligence confirmed that the reports coming out of Europe were true, we mobilized the War Refugee Board, which was responsible for saving thousands of Hungarian Jews.
And did you make any direct efforts to build up any kind of a homeland for the Jews?
We threatened all nations aligned with Germany with severe retaliation if they continued their persecution of the Jews.
And the reason you didn't bomb the railway lines leading to the death camps?
It was felt that it would not have been effective. The Germans were very efficient at repairing vital transportation links. A swift Allied victory was our only chance of saving lives. You remember the bread lines, the hopelessness. We were a nation in despair. But you believed in me and I believed in you, and together we came out of the Great Depression to build a new way of life for America. And you were with me every step of the way. When Hitler began to threaten domination of Europe, I was the one warning the Congress of the need to act. I could foresee the consequences of Nazi aggression and knew we had to send our blood and treasure to defeat this evil. The price of war was high. Perhaps more could have been done to save innocent lives. But we won the war and destroyed the most monstrous killing machine ever known to man. Let history remember that.
Mr. Holmes.
Mr. President, can you tell the court why you appointed Joseph Kennedy as ambassador to the United Kingdom?
He was an able administrator, a patriot, and
an anti-Semite.
Objection.
Sustained.
Anti-Semites vote too, don't they, Mr. President? You heard Joseph Kennedy being quoted as saying a large portion of the U.S. harbored anti-Semitic feelings. That is an important voting bloc, isn't it, Mr. President? Especially if you're running for a third term. You appointed Joseph Kennedy not in spite of his Jew-hating, but because of it.
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Your Honor, and members of the jury, the appointment of Joseph Kennedy was a brilliant political tactic. It appealed to the isolationists, the Irish Catholics, the German Americans, and most of all, the Jew haters. It was the beginning of his successful run for a third term.
This is outrageous. I was a great friend of the Jews. I appointed Felix Frankfurter to the Supreme Court. I appointed Henry Morgenthau as head of the Treasury Department.
Mr. Roosevelt, do you recall a meeting with Morgenthau on January 16, 1944?
Yes, it was the meeting that laid the foundation for the establishment of the War Refugee Board.
Do you recall the title of the report submitted to you?
Not precisely.
Your Honor, I wish to mark and admit into evidence Prosecutions Exhibit 8, a report by the Treasury Department of the State Department's handling of the refugee crisis. It was titled, Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews. The report detailed the State Department's abject failure in handling the Jewish refugee crisis. But who was the State Department? It was Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, a Roosevelt appointment. It was Joseph Kennedy, a Roosevelt appointment. It was Breckinridge Long, a Roosevelt appointment and head of the Visa Division, who in a memo circulated in June 1940 wrote, "We can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants into the United States. We could do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way and to require additional evidence and to resort to various administrative devices which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of the visas." Your Honor, I wish to submit into evidence my final exhibit.
I was born in Berlin, Germany, February 1938. And my parents were there during the Kristallnacht. Unfortunately, from what I understand, they just didn't believe that Jews were going to be killed, I suppose. And finally, after Kristallnacht, they booked a voyage on the SS St. Louis. We went back to Europe, as you know. And in Europe, we ended up in France, in southern France. And I have recollections of France, and I have recollections of that day in 1942 when we had a knock on the door. We had rented a small room, I suppose, from a French family in Naï, Les Pyrénées. And I remember the knock on the door, and there was a lot of excitement. My mother, my father, my grandfather were in that apartment. We had also been in the St. Louis. We were told to come with the French police who had come to arrest us, the Vichy police. I remember going over to my grandfather, who was too sick to travel. He was lying in bed crying. And I didn't understand it. I was 4.5 years old, and he just couldn't contain himself. And I said, "Opa, Opa, please don't cry. We'll be back. We'll come back." That's about the only recollection I have. And then we were taken to a camp called Gurs, which is in the southern part of France. I don't have too many recollections of that. I remember soldiers with machine guns, and I remember being fed something with tomatoes in it. But my memory became very vivid when I was in Refusal. They somehow transported us to Refusal from Gurs. And I was in a children's barrack, and my parents came to visit. You know, they probably were working someplace else. This is what I imagine. And my mother was holding me on her knee, and we were having a wonderful time. I must have been very, very delighted to be with her, and she with me. And all of a sudden, as she was playing with me, she stopped. And I'll never forget the look in her eye when she said to me something like, "Mommy and Daddy have to go away. I want you to be a good girl." I don't remember the exact words, but the look in her eye is still in front of my face. And I couldn't hear it. I didn't want to hear it. A child doesn't want to hear those things. And I said, "Come on, everything will be fine. Let's play. You know, I just was anxious to play with her. And she continued playing with me. But I still remember the look in her eyes. Later on that evening, my father came in from somewhere, whispered something to my mother, And then my father said, "Come on, Judy, let's go for a walk." Picked up my hand and we went for a walk. My mother gave me a kiss on the cheek, just very casual. "Bye-bye, have a good time." And we walked. It was dark. And we walked to a place where I understand it was probably a place where the underground must have been collecting the children at the time. And my father was holding my hand 1 minute. Then he said to me, "Look over there, look over there." There must have been something that was of interest to a 4.5-year-old child because I was looking. Then I heard my father saying, "Just a minute, Judy." And he let go of my hand. I felt my hand being taken up again. And someone had given me something to drink. It was something sweet, I remember that. Perhaps hot chocolate, who knows. And here I was drinking it and looking. And then I turned around and it was someone else holding my hand. My father disappeared, my mother disappeared. I never saw them again. They were killed in Auschwitz.
Members of the jury, we ask that you hold the defendant, Franklin D. Roosevelt, accountable for being complicit in crimes against humanity. His presidency, for all its good, exposed the dangers of exceeding the term limit tradition established by the Founding Fathers. They feared a return to the monarchy with its inherent threats to the Republic. The defendant was perpetually seeking to maintain power and as such made decisions the consequences of which were disastrous for humanity. The failure to address the refugee crisis with a humanitarian ideology will haunt this nation forever. Hitler would tell the world that no one wanted the Jews. That such a declaration would become true is a tragedy beyond words.
Who has inflicted this upon us? Who has made us Jews different from all other people? Who has allowed us to suffer so terribly up until now? It is God that made us as we are. But it will be God, too, who will raise us up again. If we bear this suffering now, and if there are still Jews left when it is over, then Jews, rather than being doomed, will be held up as an example. It may even be our religion from which the world and all peoples learn good. And for that reason, and that reason alone, do we have to suffer now.
Thank you to the excellent performances by the actors and the director, Matt Carasset. At this time, I would like to invite the 4 passengers that are with us tonight, the SS St. Louis, to come and take a seat. They will lead us in the jury deliberation. And I encourage you to participate, as rarely will you ever have such an opportunity in your lifetime to meet people who bore witness to one of the most significant events in American Jewish and Holocaust history. So at this point, we'll be happy to take your questions for the passengers and myself. So, yes.
How did you forgive? We cannot forget. We cannot forgive either, because our family were killed, brothers and sisters, so many other people, for no reason whatsoever. I'm sorry to tell you that we cannot forget those things.
It's a complicated problem. Forgiving what actually happened to us in St. Louis is very difficult. On the other hand, we were lucky. We survived. And we were very lucky to be able to come to the United States, and we became Americans, and we came to appreciate the United States and what it was. And so there's a mixture of feelings that we have. I mean, we remember what happened to us in the St. Louis and the part that the United States took in what happened to us. On the other hand, eventually we came to the United States. We became Americans. So it's not a simple answer.
That's the question. How could you forgive America for what it did to you?
There's really, it's a very difficult, it's a difficult question, it's a difficult answer. It's, as I said, it's a mixture. To just take what happened in the St. Louis, no. I mean, it's very difficult or impossible to forgive that. Even though you can think about what some of the reasons may have been and political problems, etc. On the other hand, we are now Americans, and we identify with the United States, and so there's this dichotomy of feelings.
I would elaborate on what my colleague said. I always, when telling the story, end by saying, we have the moral victory on our side. We came here, we've had children, grandchildren who have been eminently successful here, and we are here, and the 1,000-year German Reich is long gone, thank goodness, and hopefully will be forgotten in time, whereas these contributions that we and our families have made will be sustained for a long time to come.
From a historic point of view, it is unfair to blame the people in April 19th, 2012 for what happened 72 years ago. We will never forget, and never again should this happen. And so therefore we have to be very vigilant to make sure that there is none of this anti-Semitism that can rear its ugly head in the future. But to blame the present people who have nothing to do with what happened to us is totally unfair.
I was just wondering if you could reintroduce yourself and tell us how old you were when you were on the SS St. Louis. Because I heard your names when you were over here, but I'm having trouble tracking who's doing it.
Want me to start? My name is Philip S. Freund, and I am 80 years old, to be 81 in June 5th.
You can ask me to do the math.
Well, I was on the St. Louis. I celebrated my 8th birthday in Havana Harbor.
My name is Hans Fischer, and I was 11 years old when I boarded the St. Louis.
My name is Herbert Carliner, and I was 12 and a half years old. I'm the oldest one.
I guess I'm the youngest one. My name is Saul Messenger. I celebrated my 7th birthday on the ship 2 days before we landed in Antwerp.
Questions?
Well, I guess I would follow up on how old you were. Do you remember sitting in Havana then, and you were old enough to remember?
Oh, absolutely. Traumatic event, no matter how young you are, traumatic events you remember very well. I mean, I was 7, they were older. When you're that age, you remember things, and especially those things. I mean, I have personally vivid memories of Havana Harbor and the ships, the little boats with our relatives in them who were they were already in Cuba, circling the ship. I have vivid memories of the ship itself and how my parents behaved, etc. I mean, and as a matter of fact, I have vivid memories of what happened to me and my family before we were on the ship in Germany. You know, at age 7 and older, you remember these things. And when they're traumatic, you really remember them.
I was on the ship, and I remember vividly by cruising the Strait of Florida. And I happened to see Miami Beach. We were hoping to go to Miami, and a Caribbean Coast Guard cutter and chased us away. But I was very much impressed when I saw Miami Beach, and I said to myself, I was 12 and a half years old, someday I would like to live there. Well, it took me a long way around, but I came back to the States in 1947, after I was in France, hidden and through all kind of places. In 1947, I came to Hartford, Connecticut, and I went to night school. And I met a guy there who had a car, and he said he's going to the winter to Miami. So I asked him, can I go with you? He said, sure. I came through. I came to Miami in 1948, it was winter time in New York, and it was a paradise. I loved it. I worked here in Miami Beach for a season, and I worked one time in the Catskill Mountain in New York, and then I got a letter from Uncle Sam. I want you. In 1939, he didn't want me. I was drafted in the army, and I passed my interpreter test, French and German, and where do you think they sent me? Korea. You know the old way saying, the right way, the wrong way, and the army way. But anyway, as soon as I came back out of the army, I went back to Miami Beach, and I lived in Miami Beach since that time.
First question?
In light of your experience, and we see our situation today, and we see Israel, and we see the Jewish population being threatened again, what is your response to that? And what should our response to be? Because in the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Esther speaks very clearly, do not be silent. And I'm curious, in light of your experience, your words to us at this time in our history.
I think that as a consequence of our experience, we are perhaps doubly sensitive to the danger to which Israel is exposed constantly by Iran. And it worries us terribly. We worry about what is going to happen. That's all I can say. And what your reaction is, I could suggest some things, but I won't.
I can answer you that too. That's why we go to churches, synagogues, speak to children. I'm retired, and that's what I'm doing now. That's why we came here too, to educate to children forever. It can happen again. It can happen even here in the United States. we want to be, especially the new generation, to be aware that it can happen. That's why we're trying to teach them our experience so they don't have to go through what we went through.
Do you have any knowledge of the survival rate of the 900 Jews? How many survived the war years, and how did that all turn out?
Actually, a book was written by people who work at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. They investigated all 937 passengers on the St. Louis, and they found out what happened to 936 of them. And it was found that I think it was 36% of the passengers died in the Holocaust. I had thought that it would be much more. But you have to remember that quite a large group of passengers from the St. Louis ended up in England. They survived because Hitler did not invade England. It was the passengers of the St. Louis who ended up in Belgium, Holland, and France who were at risk, and many died.
254 of the passengers were killed by the Nazis. One of the things I'd like to call your attention to is the fact that we were sitting down in Miami Harbor looking, hoping, praying that they would change their mind and let us come off the ship. In fact, there is even a abandoned or in a lower status than active of a camp called Camp Landing south of Jacksonville, Florida. We could easily have been sent there, lived there until our quota number came up. And just recently it came to my attention that 100,000 unused quota numbers were found at the end of World War II. Think of all those people who could have been saved except for the prejudice of certain people in the State Department. In fact, his picture was shown tonight on the screen. That, to me, is the crime of the century, because we could easily have been brought ashore and allowed to live.
Do you have a sense of the United States failing to act since that time? Do you have a sense of indignation in other international incidents? I'm thinking particularly of the genocide in Rwanda. Do you have any sense of that? Yeah, I mean, it was a very different situation, but have you seen other failures of the United States, and would you name them?
It's a tough question to answer. Yeah, I mean, the United States, look, the United States is not a perfect country. I think we have to admit that. I think it's a fantastic country, but it's certainly not perfect, and we all have to work to make it better, and I think most of us do, all of us do. Could we have done more in other areas of refugee problems? Yeah, I think we probably could. I think the difference, for instance, with Rwanda and people in St. Louis, is that the Rwandans were in Africa. We were in Miami. I mean, there is that obvious difference. It doesn't mean that the United States shouldn't act on behalf of people who are being prejudiced against and who are being threatened and so on. But there was a geographic, physical difference.
The United States has stepped in many, many difficult situations where people's lives were threatened. Rwanda just being one of them. I think that if we went to every country that had a problem, internal, external, I think that the American people wouldn't hold still for it. That's one thing, because it's also extremely expensive financially, as well as American lives are being lost. Look at how many of our servicemen have been killed in Afghanistan and in Iraq and so on. The American public is very generous in what they have contributed to the safety of many, many people. I know Rwanda and some of these other African countries are having a very difficult time. My question to you is, should we step in every time that there is a problem? I don't know. I don't have the answer. But I do know that the American public won't hold still for it for too long.
After being turned away, how did the adults try to comfort you as children with their desperation of knowing what was about to take place as you are leaving American waters?
There was an enormous amount of, if you want to call it that, political activity on the boat. There were all kinds of committees trying to sort things out, to see whom else to send telegrams to, and to see and to talk with the captain of the boat to see what the options might be. And as we later found out, the captain of the boat, who was a German, had made contingency plans to run the boat ashore off the coast of Scotland, and even to set it on fire so that Great Britain would have to take us in. So I don't recall the adults being particularly concerned, talking to the children and trying to assuage our fears and so on. What I do remember, someone asked earlier, what do we remember about the boat? I remember that I was much more optimistic than many others. I was together with other friends, and I remember when the boat left Havana, weighed anchor of Havana, I was playing chess with a friend, and we talked to each other what is going to happen to us next. I might also add that on our trip back to Europe, conditions were not as beautiful and rosy, and the food was not what it had been on the way over. So there was a stark reality that things were not very good. And yet, I think we children were much more optimistic that the outcome ultimately was going to be all right.
We're going to take one more question, and then we have a ceremony where Mr. Hans Fischer is going to give his signature on a document, which I'll explain in a minute.
I want to mention something else. We didn't know that, but after we found out that we had to pay a round-trip ticket on the ship. Look where there was snow, that's true. We were wondering why. Did anybody want to emigrate to the States or anybody else had a round-trip ticket? Why did we have to buy this? I think it was all prepared beforehand, that we were not allowed to come to Havana or any other countries. Recently I was reading the paper, the island of an American Caribbean. No, American.
It's the Virgin Islands.
Virgin Islands wanted to accept us because they didn't have the people there. And the governor asked the American government if they can come in, and we were refused. So more and more it sounded to me like it was all prepared for them. And I believe truthfully that was the beginning of the Holocaust. It shows you that the Jews were, take whatever they want to do with us.
Expendable.
Expendable.
Okay, we'll take one more question, then there'll be a reception upstairs.
Can I make a comment? Thank you. As a member of this illustrious group, I would just like to say that we came to this country with nothing, and I mean nothing. We had 2 suitcases and 10 marks, $4.20. Came here, and it was out of desperation. My mother had to give me up to my uncle and my aunt who raised me until the end of World War II, and my uncle who had volunteered as a doctor to take care of the U.S. Military people. I was given the opportunity to go to college and to make something of myself. And I was fortunate enough that I foresaw that the only way I could get an education and to improve my status was to join the Army. And as you saw in the bio, I ended up a full colonel. Only in America. When I was stationed in Washington, D.C., my boss said to me, I want you to go into town. They're having an international reservist meeting. I want you to represent the command. When I went there, and I laughed at a joke that a Swiss officer made to the German representative, and I laughed, and he said, you speak German? I said, yes. And he said, where are you from? I told him, and he said, you know, in the Swiss Army, we wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole. Not because I was Jewish, but because I was not part of the elite. They only took the top, and I wasn't at the top, believe me. The British officer said, you could be a sergeant major. The Frenchman said, we wouldn't touch you, we'd send you into the Foreign Legion. So my comment to you is, God bless America, because this is the greatest country in the history of the world.
One more question?
These SS St. Louis was turned away in the name of, immigration laws. And with all the discussion of immigration laws today, has your experience influenced your thoughts on today's immigration debate?
Look, my feeling about immigration, look, we're all, I think all of us are ancestors of immigrants or immigrants ourselves. I mean, it's a country of immigrants. And the fact is that immigrants today are a positive thing in the United States. I think if you look at the facts, that's the truth. On the other hand, my feeling is that immigration should be legal. It should be legal. We have laws in the United States and they should be followed. If that means that fewer people than people think are allowed into the United States, then the laws should be changed. So I'm for immigration, I'm for legal immigration, but I'm not for illegal immigration. Maybe the laws need to be changed.
I have to tell you something else, David, which bothered me for many years. I lived in Miami Beach. In 1939, the United States wouldn't let us in. But in 1960, 125,000 Cuban refugees came to Miami. and nobody said a word. We let them in with no question asked who they were or what they are. And that hurted me. It still hurts me today.
Okay.
I just want to add one more thing to the immigration. The documentary that we heard before mentioned several times the 1924 immigration law. And I have a special hatred of that law because even after we were on the ship, this law kept us from coming into the United States, because in 1924, Congress passed this particular immigration law, which said that the quotas depended on the nationality of the country in which you were born in 1924. Now, my father was born in a town that was Germany when he was born there in 1890. In 1924, after World War I, it was Polish, and the Polish quota was minuscule. And so we couldn't come into the United States. Actually, my mother, my sister, and I could have come because we were German quota. We were born in a city that was still part of Germany after World War I. But my father couldn't have come, and we weren't going to be separated from him again. And there were so many anomalies in that 1924 law. The same thing happened later when I married my wife, who came from South America. She also couldn't have come, but she married me, and I was a citizen, so she could come by virtue of my having been a citizen. Otherwise, she also wouldn't have come, because the 1924 law was still in effect in 1950. So I also want to say one thing about immigration. I agree with my friend Messenger. The greatness of this country is due to this enormous diversity of genes that are brought in by all the different nationalities and ethnic groups in this country. We wouldn't have iPods and all the rest of the big advantages that come from the brain power that has been created. And no other country has immigration opportunities that lead to the success of this great country.